My dad and stepmom changed my locks to steal my house for my pregnant stepsister, but when I fought. My name is Hannah Nealman. I'm 35 years old, and I restore historic homes for a living. I've worked on townhouses in Charleston, brownstones in Brooklyn, and even a crumbling adobe mission in New Mexico. But no project ever felt as personal as the one I inherited from my great-grandmother Frances, a colonial revival home in Ridgefield, Connecticut, with ivy climbing its porch columns, and a stubborn elm that had watched 5 generations come and go. I never imagined that house would become the center of the most humiliating betrayal of my life. When my father Thomas and his wife Valerie changed the locks while I was away, I thought it was some mistake. But then I saw baby furniture moving into the guest room I had restored with my own hands, and I realized they weren't mistaken. They were staking a claim, not just on a house, but on my history, my work, my identity. 6 months before it all fell apart, my life was steady, almost predictable. I had clients on wait lists, a loyal dog named Baxter, and a quiet circle of friends who respected boundaries. After losing my mother to cancer when I was 16, I learned not to expect too much from blood relatives. My father remarried within the year, to Valerie, a public relations consultant who always smelled like expensive hairspray and ambition. She brought her daughter Aubrey into our lives, a quiet girl who watched everyone like she was studying us for a future role. At the time, I was too numb to care. I threw myself into school, then work, and eventually created a life with enough distance to keep things civil. Holidays were short, phone calls infrequent, and we all pretended that was normal. Everything shifted when great-grandmother Frances passed and left the Ridgefield house to me outright. Her will was precise and old-fashioned, declaring I had the heart to hear what the walls remember. I moved in 2 weeks later and began restoring the house slowly, deliberately, honoring every worn corner and faded wallpaper with the same care I gave my clients' projects. Valerie made a single comment during the reading. Something about how no one under 40 should be living in a house like that. My father said nothing. I just looked disappointed, like the property had slipped through his hands. At the time, I chalked it up to ego. I didn't see it as the warning shot it was. What I remember most from those first months in the house is how quiet it was. Not empty, just peaceful. There was a rhythm to the space, creaking floorboards in the hall at dusk, the faint whistle of wind through old window panes. I began journaling again, something I hadn't done since college, just to document the strange feeling that I wasn't alone in that house. It felt like a living thing. As my career expanded, I reduced outside contracts to focus on this one passion project. Friends would ask why I wasn't renting out rooms or filming it for social media, but I wasn't doing this for attention. I was preserving something sacred. I didn't need applause. I needed the place to breathe again. Then Aubrey got pregnant. The announcement came during an awkward family dinner in Westport. Valerie cried. My father actually smiled. And Ethan, the boyfriend, sat there grinning like he'd just secured a pension. I congratulated her politely, assuming they'd want to find their own place soon. But over the next few weeks, subtle comments began to pile up. Valerie joked about how babies need space. My father asked if I ever felt lonely in such a big house. And Aubrey asked if I'd ever considered converting the back parlor into a nursery. I ignored it all, thinking it was harmless small talk. I was wrong. The first real breach came when I found Valerie in my kitchen unannounced. She claimed she was just dropping off a pie, but there was no pie, and she was wearing heels, like she had a meeting. A few days later, I noticed things were slightly out of place. A rug corner lifted, a light switch left on, my studio door ajar when I always locked it. I told myself I was being paranoid. But paranoia doesn't explain why. When I returned from a 3-day conference in Boston, my key didn't fit the front door anymore. Or why there was a moving truck in the driveway with Aubrey's boyfriend directing the unloading of a crib into what used to be my guest bedroom. I stood there for a full minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My father emerged from the house holding a box labeled Aubrey's clothes. He looked startled, then guilty. "You're back early," he said, as if I were interrupting a casual afternoon. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Valerie stepped outside with her usual forced elegance, smoothing her collar. "There's been a change," she said calmly. It's time this house became a home for someone who needs it. I asked what they meant. I told them my name was on the deed. That the house was mine. Legally and ethically. But they had planned for that. The locks were changed. My belongings boxed up. And they had filed paperwork while I was away, claiming I had abandoned the property. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. Aubrey stood in the doorway, one hand on her stomach, looking embarrassed, but not enough to stop what was happening. I asked where my things were. Valerie said they were in a storage unit, safe and secure, as if that was some favor. They had taken everything. My house, my history, my work, and all I could do in that moment was step backward down the porch steps, as if I were the one trespassing. That night, sitting in a motel room with a single suitcase and a phone full of missed calls from people who had heard I'd had a breakdown, I realized the story they were spreading was working. They weren't just stealing a house. They were erasing me from it. I spent that first night pacing the beige carpet of a roadside motel that smelled like mildew and forgotten arguments. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the front door of my house, the house I had restored with my own hands sealed shut by a lock I didn't recognize. I kept replaying my father's expression, that dull mixture of discomfort and conviction, like he knew what he was doing was wrong, but had decided long ago to do it anyway. The worst part was the realization that this had been planned for weeks, maybe longer. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated, deliberate erasure. By morning, my phone had exploded with missed calls and messages, mostly from people I hadn't heard from in months. My cousin Nora sent a long text asking if I was getting the help I needed. An old colleague from New York emailed to say he was so sorry to hear about my mental health leave. The words didn't make sense at first. Then the pieces began to align. They weren't just stealing my house. They were reshaping the narrative around me. While I was at a conference giving a keynote on restorative architecture, they were telling everyone I'd had a breakdown and needed time away. They were softening the ground, preparing the world to accept a version of events in which I had simply given up my home voluntarily. Or worse, had been gently removed from it for my own good. That morning, I drove back into Ridgefield and stopped at a gas station I rarely used. The cashier, who usually barely looked up from his register, greeted me with a hesitant smile and asked if I was doing okay now. I asked what he meant, and he mumbled something about how people were saying I'd been under a lot of stress, that my family was taking care of things. That phrase, taking care of things, made me nauseous. It wasn't just a theft. It was a campaign. They had planted a version of reality where I was unstable, isolated, and in need of protection. That version left them looking like heroes, not thieves. I called my father that afternoon, not because I expected honesty, but because I wanted to hear him lie. He picked up on the second ring, his voice calm. "Even warm. Hannah," he said. "We've all been so worried." I didn't respond right away. I let the silence hang between us until it turned heavy. Finally, I said, "What exactly have you told people about me?" He didn't miss a beat. "Only that you've been going through a difficult time. Valerie thought it would be best if we shielded you from the pressure of daily upkeep. The house was becoming too much, wasn't it?" I almost laughed at how rehearsed it sounded. Like he'd practiced it. Like he genuinely believed I'd fall in line with the version of events he'd crafted. I told him I was hiring a lawyer. His tone didn't change. "That's unnecessary. Let's not escalate this. Think about your reputation. Hannah, these things can spiral quickly." It was the kind of threat that hides behind concern. I hung up without another word. That night, I drove to Claire's apartment in Stamford. Claire had been my closest friend since our first internship. She was the one who stayed up with me during all-nighters, who mailed me vitamins during a project in Detroit, who had helped me move furniture into the Ridgefield house on that first foggy morning. When she opened the door, she didn't ask questions. She just poured wine and sat beside me. After I told her everything, she didn't say much. She just reached into a drawer and handed me a folder. Inside were printed screenshots, photos from my Instagram, dated calendar invites, contractor invoices, with my signature. She looked me in the eye and said, "If they're claiming you weren't living there, start documenting. Every trace you've left behind is a thread you can pull." Claire wasn't a lawyer. But she understood the power of proof. That night, I started building my own file. Every utility bill, in my name. Every delivery confirmation, photos of the rooms I had renovated. Stepmom. I emailed my contractor to confirm when we had redone the upstairs windows. I called my vet to get records showing Baxter's home address. Over the next week, I stayed with Claire while quietly assembling my case. I didn't tell anyone else where I was. Meanwhile, messages from family friends kept coming, asking if I was feeling better, offering support that felt like pity wrapped in curiosity. One distant aunt sent flowers with a card that read, "You're in our prayers." So glad Valerie stepped in. It was surreal. They had built a scaffolding of lies around me, and from the outside, it looked like a rescue. Then came the email that snapped something in me. It was from Valerie. No greeting. No explanation. Just an attached photo of Aubrey, standing in the foyer of my house, one hand on her belly, smiling beside a vintage bassinet I had spent weeks restoring. The caption read, "Almost ready for baby boy's arrival." My stomach twisted. Not just because they were taking over my house, but because they were parading it, using it, reshaping it into something unrecognizable while pretending I had no stake in it. I forwarded the email to a local lawyer named Marcus Carraway, a name I remembered from the reading of great-grandmother Frances's will. He had been the one to say, Frances had great faith in Hannah's stewardship. I asked for a meeting. The next day, I sat in his office, hands shaking as I slid the photo across the desk. He studied it for a long time, then looked up and asked a single question. When exactly did they change the locks? The lock change had happened on the second morning of my Boston trip. I had left Ridgefield on a Thursday, presented on Friday, and planned to stay through Sunday. That Saturday morning, according to my neighbor Lucia, a locksmith arrived around 8 a.m., followed by a moving truck 30 minutes later. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. From her perspective, it looked like a planned relocation. She saw my father standing in the driveway, clipboard in hand, greeting the movers like he owned the place. When I visited her 2 days later, trying to piece together the timeline, her face fell with guilt, as she said, "I honestly thought you had given them permission." I asked if she'd be willing to write that down. She didn't hesitate. She was in her 70s, had known my great-grandmother for decades, and had been quietly horrified when the rumors began spreading that I'd suffered a breakdown. She knew the house had always been mine in spirit, long before the will made it legal. As I sipped lukewarm tea at her kitchen table, she pulled a dusty manila envelope from a drawer and handed it to me. Inside were old Polaroids of Frances hosting garden parties, Christmas dinners, and summer lemonade socials. And in almost every photo, I was somewhere in the background. A girl with scraped knees or paint on her hands, always touching something, always repairing, or planting, or painting. "This has always been your place," she said quietly. "They're trying to rewrite history." When I returned to Marcus Carraway's office with the photos, the timeline from Lucia, and my growing file of evidence, he listened carefully before leaning back in his chair. He explained that claims of property abandonment required proof of intent, not just absence. 3 days away for work didn't qualify. He also raised an eyebrow when I mentioned my father had filed change of ownership paperwork. "That would be fraud unless he had your signature," he said. I shook my head. "He doesn't." Marcus then asked if I'd ever signed anything granting power of attorney or co-ownership. He hadn't. Every document related to the house had been signed solely in my name, and I had a scanned copy of Frances's will to prove it. Then he surprised me. He opened a drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges. "Your great-grandmother left this with me," he said, "to be opened only if her will was challenged or the property was contested." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter written in Frances's neat cursive, dated 6 months before her death. She wrote about her concern that Thomas and Valerie viewed the house as a financial asset, not a legacy. She mentioned overhearing them at Thanksgiving, discussing what could be done with the land and how Hannah would probably never settle down anyway. She had taken steps to protect the home from any future dispute. According to the letter, a second trust had been created, one that held ownership of the property in my name, separate from the will. It also granted Marcus the authority to intervene legally if needed. The trust included funding specifically for legal defense and property restoration, in case I was ever pressured to sell. There was more. Frances had installed security cameras throughout the house after a break-in scare 3 years prior. She had asked the technician to make the system discreet, hidden behind vents and paneling, with footage saved directly to cloud storage. The system hadn't been deactivated. Marcus made a call, and within hours, a tech assistant retrieved the cloud access credentials from Frances's files. We didn't know yet what the cameras had caught, but if they were rolling during the weekend I was in Boston, we could have direct visual proof that my father and Valerie had entered the house without consent and changed the locks unlawfully. That night, I returned to Claire's apartment with more resolve than fear. For the first time since this began, I felt like I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid or overreacting. I had been methodically stripped of something sacred, and the people doing it had counted on me staying silent. They wanted me to doubt myself. They wanted the world to think I was fragile, irrational, unreliable. But they had underestimated what quiet women can do when they've been cornered. Over the next few days, Marcus filed motions to prevent any sale or transfer of the property, citing the trust and presenting initial evidence of trespassing and fraudulent misrepresentation. We obtained temporary orders blocking any construction or renovations on the property. Claire helped organize the files, labeling photos, timestamps, and receipts. I gathered witness statements from neighbors, delivery drivers, and even the local mail carrier, who confirmed he had never stopped delivering my mail to that address. I was rebuilding my case, one receipt and timestamp at a time. Then came the footage. Marcus's assistant called me into the office late one afternoon and showed me the first clip. The video clearly showed my father unlocking the front door with a key. Then, waving in a team of movers, Valerie arrived an hour later and began directing the removal of boxes. At one point, she paused in front of the fireplace, took down a framed photo of me and Frances, and handed it to Aubrey, who wrapped it in bubble wrap and set it aside. I felt something tighten in my chest. That image wasn't just evidence, it was personal. They hadn't just broken into my house, they had dismantled my life with surgical precision, piece by piece, photo by photo. I asked Marcus what our next move would be. He looked at me calmly and said, "We let them walk into our office. Then we show them what the walls remember." The meeting was set for Wednesday at 10 a.m. in the wood-paneled conference room at Caraway and Finch. Marcus insisted we give them no hint of what we had prepared. Let them believe they were walking into a formality, a mediation, or maybe even an apology. He knew people like Valerie and my father, people who dressed their ambition in civility and assumed everyone else would be too polite to challenge them. I wore black slacks, a cream blouse, and my grandmother's ring. Claire came with me and sat 2 chairs back, silent, but solid. As I waited, I thought about the hours I had spent sanding the banister of the main staircase, each pass of my hand restoring what years of neglect had dulled. I wondered what that banister looked like now. I wondered if Aubrey had painted over the original finish. They arrived 15 minutes late. My father looked thinner than I remembered. He was wearing the same navy blazer he wore at my college graduation. Valerie's hair was perfect as always, and she wore that fixed smile I had come to associate with the start of manipulation. Aubrey trailed behind them, eyes downcast, one hand resting on her stomach like a shield. Their lawyer was a man named Frank Redmond, a local estate attorney whose name I only recognized because he'd once represented someone who tried to subdivide a landmark property and got shut down by zoning. He nodded politely at Marcus, who returned the gesture with the warmth of a glacier. Once seated, Marcus didn't waste time. He passed printed folders down the table, one for each of them. "Before we begin, I'd like everyone to take a look at the contents of these files. What you'll find includes time-stamped footage of the weekend in question, documents proving active residence, utility records, and a notarized trust filed independently of the will, naming Hannah as the sole and protected steward of the property in question." I watched Valerie flip through the folder with increasing stiffness. My father paled visibly as he turned to the still image from the camera, showing him unlocking the front door with movers behind him. Aubrey didn't open hers. Their lawyer cleared his throat and said, It appears there's been some miscommunication. Marcus leaned forward slightly, voice calm but unmistakably firm. There has been no miscommunication. There has been fraud, unlawful entry, and a sustained defamation campaign against my client, designed to justify the illegal occupation of her property. My father opened his mouth, but Marcus held up a hand. Let's be clear. This is not a negotiation. This is an opportunity for remedy before escalation. If you agree to vacate the property immediately, issue full retractions to the claims made against Hannah's mental health, and pay restitution for damages and legal fees, we will withhold criminal prosecution. Refuse, and we file charges within the hour. Valerie finally spoke, her voice tight but composed. We were trying to keep the house in the family. Hannah was never going to have children. It made sense for it to go to someone who would actually live in it. I stared at her for a moment, more tired than angry. So you decided I didn't deserve my own inheritance because I wasn't building a family fast enough for your standards. She didn't answer. My father looked at his lap. Aubrey finally glanced up, her eyes glassy. I didn't want it to go this far, she whispered. I just wanted a place for the baby. Claire shifted in her chair, but said nothing. I kept my gaze steady. You had every chance to talk to me. Instead, you changed my locks and packed away my life while telling people I was having a breakdown. Frank Redmond leaned toward Valerie and said something quietly. She stiffened, then nodded once. We'd like to resolve this privately, he said, addressing Marcus. Give us until end of day. Marcus agreed. 5 o'clock. No extensions. They left without further argument. Aubrey lingered for a beat, then followed them out the door. That afternoon, Marcus received a signed agreement from their lawyer. Immediate vacancy. No contestation of the trust. A public statement retracting claims about my mental health, and compensation for damage to the house and storage costs. It wasn't an apology, but it was accountability, backed by law. I returned to the house the next morning with the locksmith and a moving truck. The front lawn was empty. The windows were dark. Inside, the walls smelled of fresh paint and cheap candles. My photos were gone, replaced with generic prints. The kitchen felt colder, more impersonal. The nursery they had started was half finished. Paint cans still open. A crib pushed into the corner, like an afterthought. I stood in the foyer, one hand on the doorframe, and breathed. It wasn't victory I felt. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Quieter. The sensation of claiming space, not just legally, but emotionally. The house had been taken from me without permission, but I had taken it back with proof. Not revenge. With presence. Not destruction. As I walked through the rooms, I began noting what would need to be undone. The overlay of someone else's life would take time to peel back, like removing a cheap laminate from solid wood. But underneath, the bones were still there. The structure was sound, and I had no doubt the house remembered who it belonged to. The first thing I did after changing the locks back and resetting the security system was remove every trace of lavender air freshener they had used. It clung to the walls like a cover-up, masking the real scent of aged pine, old stone, and time-worn fabric. My great-grandmother's home had never smelled like an advertisement. It had smelled like cinnamon bread, turpentina, rose, soap, and occasionally wet leaves tracked in by boots in autumn. Now, walking through the rooms, I felt like I was trying to breathe through someone else's choices. I opened every window, even the stiff ones in the attic, and let the wind cut through the stillness. The damage wasn't structural, but it was personal. They had replaced the hooks in the mudroom where Frances once hung her sun hat. They'd painted over the faded stencil in the upstairs hallway that read 1926, in the year her parents finished the second floor. In the kitchen, the drawer where she kept recipes had been emptied, and the linoleum mat she used to stand on while peeling apples had been thrown away. It wasn't destruction. It was erasure. The kind done by people who didn't think they were doing anything wrong, only improving things, modernizing, streamlining, as if a home could be improved by forgetting the people who built it. I spent the next few days alone, scrubbing, sanding, cataloging. I took photos of everything I planned to restore and made notes about what would require custom replacements. The crown molding in the nursery had been chipped during crib assembly. The original brass doorknobs had been swapped for smooth modern levers. In the back garden, the bird bath Frances had installed after her mother died was cracked, likely from being moved to make space for a portable fire pit. Discovery made me pause, not out of sadness, but clarity. They had seen this house as a project. I saw it as a memory you could walk through. Neighbors dropped by quietly during the week. Lucia brought over scones and left them on the porch with a note that read, "Welcome home. For real this time." The mailman nodded solemnly when he saw me, saying, "Glad you're back where you belong." A few people who had once believed Valerie's version of events offered awkward apologies. I didn't hold it against them. It's easy to believe the loudest story, especially when it's wrapped in professionalism and performed with a smile. That's what Valerie was good at. She never shouted. She just said things in the right rooms and waited for them to spread like perfume on a blazer. Aubrey didn't reach out. Neither did my father. I wasn't sure if that disappointed me or not. There was a strange comfort in the silence, the space between us finally mirroring the emotional distance that had existed for years. I didn't hate them. That would have required a level of intimacy we hadn't had in a long time. What I felt was more like recognition. I finally understood that they had never really seen me as someone separate from their ambitions. I was a placeholder, a narrative obstacle, a quiet inconvenience that had overstayed her welcome in a house they had long ago claimed in their minds. One evening, while organizing the crawl space above the pantry, I found a shoebox tucked behind insulation panels. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters, rubber-banded together by year. They were from Frances to her sister Margaret, written over decades. Some were typed, others scrawled in blue ink, all signed with the same closing. "The house still stands." She had written through world wars, economic recessions, and personal loss. In one letter dated 1978, she described her fear that Thomas has no soul for history, and that he had once asked if the old barn could be demolished for a pool. She had laughed it off in the letter but added, "When I go, I pray Hannah will be strong enough to carry what I leave behind." I read that line 3 times. It was the first moment I cried since getting the house back. Not from weakness, but from something closer to affirmation. She had known. She had seen it coming. And she had trusted me to hold the line. I didn't respond to the emails from Valerie's attorney offering a more amicable debrief. I didn't take the calls from aunts who had stayed silent when things were unclear, but now wanted to reconnect. I answered one voicemail from a woman named April, a friend of my mother's, who had sent me a handwritten card after the false stories about my mental health spread. She came by on a Saturday with 2 cartons of eggs from her hens and a photo of me at age 10 standing in front of the Ridgefield house, holding a hammer twice too big for my hands. "You've been a builder since the beginning," she said, not as a compliment, just a fact. That night, I wrote for hours, not in a rage, not to document, just to mark the shift. Something had closed, not like a slammed door, but like a book with the last page read. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was no longer surviving what they did. I was deciding what I would build in the quiet they left behind. I wrote about justice, not as punishment, but as balance. About how spaces remember who cherishes them, and how some betrayals don't end with confrontation, but with careful restoration, the kind that doesn't just repair what was broken, but reclaims what was true. It had been 3 weeks since I moved back into the house, and most of the rooms were finally starting to feel like themselves again. I had repainted the nursery, stripping the glossy beige they had slapped on over the original pale green and restoring the custom moldings with care. The dining room was the last to recover. Valerie had turned it into a sort of home office, or perhaps a planning space for the baby shower. Judging by the dry erase calendar, still taped to the wall, I peeled it off gently, folded it once, and dropped it into the box marked evidence, not keepsakes. I didn't want to burn it. I wanted to remember what they had done. Not because I couldn't forgive, but because I wasn't interested in pretending it hadn't happened. The legal documents were filed and finalized. My name was on the deed, reinforced by both the original will and the private trust. The retraction letters had been sent to every contact they had once misinformed, including business partners, neighbors, family members, and my former colleagues, Valerie's carefully curated image was the first to unravel. A local magazine that once featured her modern matriarch profile ran a quiet correction, acknowledging her role in a disputed inheritance and false mental health allegations. Her public speaking invitations disappeared one by one. A wellness brand that had previously sponsored her social campaigns removed her image from their site without announcement. The fallout was slow but definitive, like the tide pulling away from a sandcastle that had stood too close to the waterline. My father fared differently. At first, he remained publicly silent, perhaps assuming the matter would die down, and that the family would eventually reunite with enough time and plausible deniability. But clients are observant, and Ridgefield is not as large as he liked to believe. 2 long-term real estate investors pulled out of a downtown renovation project he was managing, citing ethical concerns. One of his former partners, a man named Alan, who had always treated me with polite skepticism, sent me a message on LinkedIn that simply read, "I had no idea. I'm sorry." I didn't respond, but I saved it anyway. Aubrey's silence was more complicated. She hadn't spoken to me since the legal meeting, and I hadn't expected her to. But one Friday afternoon, as I returned from the post office, I saw her car parked across from the house. She stood beside it, arms folded over her belly, looking not quite like someone waiting, but not fully able to walk away either. I didn't invite her in. I stood on the walkway and asked what she needed. She hesitated, then said, "You were always better at everything." I knew that, but I never thought you'd fight like this. I told her that I hadn't wanted to fight. I just wanted what was mine, left to me with trust and clarity. She didn't argue. Instead, she asked if I had read the articles. I seen what was happening to Valerie and our father. I said I had. She nodded once, almost like that answer surprised her. Then she said something I didn't expect. "They didn't just take your house. They took your name. They wanted to wear your stability like a costume. But you didn't let them." I didn't know what to say to that. It was too honest, too raw to be manipulation. I looked at her for a long time, trying to decide if that single moment of recognition could outweigh everything that came before it. It couldn't, but it mattered that she said it. I told her I hoped she would raise her child in truth, not performance. She nodded again, then turned back to her car and drove away without another word. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the house with a flashlight, something I used to do during storm seasons when I lived here before. I checked the drainage, the window seals, the shed roofline. Everything held. Inside, I lit a single lamp in the library and read one of Frances's older journals, dated 1964. In it, she wrote about losing her sister to illness, about how the house felt too quiet afterward, but also about how she learned to live in it again by making new rhythms, not by trying to bring back the old ones. She ended the entry with a line that felt so familiar, I had to reread it twice. Some houses are not meant to be inherited in silence. They must be fought for. Not to own, but to honor. The next morning, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photo of my mother, young, smiling in front of the same fireplace Valerie had tried to redesign. It was printed from a scan, slightly faded, but unmistakable. On the back was a note in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. It simply read, "You were always her reflection." No signature. I held it for a while before placing it on the mantel. Not because I needed to hold on to it forever, but because in that moment, it felt like the right thing to do. Some days, I still check the locks before bed twice instead of once. Not out of fear, but to remind myself that control, once reclaimed, must be maintained gently, deliberately. The kind of control that doesn't hurt others, doesn't lie, and doesn't pretend, just holds the line quietly, for as long as needed. The first event I hosted after reclaiming the house wasn't a celebration. It wasn't a dinner party or a restoration unveiling. It was a quiet, early afternoon gathering with 7 women, all colleagues from different stages of my career. Some were architects. One was a former preservation officer. 2 were old clients who had become friends. I made tea, sliced apples with sharp cheddar, and opened the parlor windows just enough to let in the soft movement of autumn. We didn't talk about what had happened. Not directly. We talked about houses, about women being erased from credit on projects they had led, about design competitions where male partners took the stage and the applause while we took the notes. It wasn't a formal support circle, but it felt like one. And when they left, one by one, every woman paused at the entryway, like they could feel the weight of the home's return to itself. No one needed to say it, but we all knew. The house was no longer just a structure. It had become a line I had drawn and defended. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation in the mail. It was addressed to Hannah Neilman, printed in embossed script on heavy cardstock. The kind of invitation people send when they still believe reputation alone is currency. It was for Aubrey's baby shower, to be hosted at Valerie's cousin's estate, 2 towns over. No mention of what had happened. No acknowledgement of what had nearly been stolen. Just a pastel invitation with faux gold lettering and a request to RSVP. I placed it on the fireplace mantel and left it there for 2 days before finally putting it in the recycling bin. Not with anger, but with clarity. I didn't need to show up to prove I was the bigger person. I already knew who I was. And that truth didn't require an audience. Claire stopped by that same afternoon. She had brought a bottle of sparkling cider and an envelope full of old photos we had once taken on the job. Back when we were both broke, and hopeful, and a little too eager to please. We sat on the back steps, barefoot, sipping quietly, while the trees began to lose their leaves. Claire glanced toward the garden and said, "You know, you could have walked away. No one would have blamed you. And yet you stayed? That means something." I nodded. Not to agree or disagree, but to acknowledge that she had spoken something real. I stayed because some things deserve more than passive survival. They deserve stewardship. They deserve to be seen through. That evening, I received an email from a local historical society asking if I would consider allowing them to feature the home on their winter tour. They had heard about the restoration and defense efforts and thought it might inspire others dealing with contested family estates. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I wasn't looking for publicity. But maybe letting people walk through a house that had survived not just time, but betrayal, could teach something more lasting than any article ever could. I wrote back and said yes. On one condition, that no part of the tour would mention names. The story would be about legacy, not scandal. Around that same time, I decided to expand the East Library wing into a small reading salon. Frances had once talked about wanting to host community reading nights, but it had never happened. I worked with a carpenter named Lena, a quiet, meticulous woman who restored the leaded glass panels by hand and helped me build shelving around the original fireplace without disturbing its 1,920 stonework. The first night the room was complete, I sat alone under the pendant light and read aloud from Frances's earliest journal. Just a few pages. Enough to feel the echo of what once was, and enough to realize I was no longer restoring something broken. I was building forward. One afternoon, I opened the front door and found a package wrapped in plain brown paper. No noche. Inside was a leather-bound baby book. Nearly empty, except for the first page, which read, "Born into a world still being made right." I recognized Aubrey's handwriting, smaller and tighter than when we were younger. I placed the book on the shelf between 2 antique ledgers, not because I forgave everything, but because not all offerings need to be accepted or rejected. Some can simply exist as proof that truth leaves traces, even in the hands of those who once distorted it. That night, I walked through the house in the dark, barefoot, touching the coolness of the walls, the curve of the staircase, the slightly uneven floorboards in the hall. I didn't feel haunted. I felt rooted. Frances had once told me that the strongest foundations were built not only with stone and wood, but with choice. Not every inheritance is a gift. Some are obligations disguised as blessings. But when you fight to make them your own, when you choose what to carry forward and what to leave behind, they become something else entirely. They become a home. By the first snowfall, the house felt whole again. Not perfect, not pristine, but whole in the way a place becomes after being fought for and chosen every day since. The windows no longer rattled in the night. The baseboards no longer creaked like they were holding their breath. Even the smallest things, like the patina on the doorknobs or the faint scuff marks near the pantry, I felt like a language only I could read. I had reclaimed it not just physically, but emotionally. It no longer reminded me of loss. It reminded me of boundary, of clarity, of what it meant to choose your name over your comfort. That winter, I started a small workshop series out of the old breakfast room. It wasn't publicized, just shared through word of mouth. Women came. Some brought sketches of their grandmothers' homes. Others brought building permits they had been denied, or contracts they had been pushed out of. We talked about design, but also about legacy, about who gets to claim space, and who's expected to stay quiet. The room was warm, the tea always strong, and the sense of belonging, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration in its truest form, the kind that didn't require anyone's downfall, just a steady insistence that your presence had value all along. In mid-January, I received a letter forwarded from my old firm. It was from a former junior associate who'd been in a similar situation I hadn't known about at the time. She wrote that watching what happened to me made her finally speak up when her work was being passed off as someone else's prose-in. She wrote that she'd been afraid, but then remembered that integrity doesn't always win fast. But it lasts longer than charm. I read the letter twice, and placed it in the drawer with Frances's journals. Some victories aren't loud. They echo slowly. Around the same time, my father sent a message through Marcus. It wasn't an apology, but a request for a meeting. He said he wanted to understand where things had gone wrong. I sat with that offer for 3 days. Eventually, I declined not because I needed to punish him, but because I didn't believe he truly wanted to understand. I believed he wanted resolution without reckoning, and I had learned the hard way that not every story deserves a reunion scene. Some deserve respectful silence. Valerie had stopped appearing in local functions. Her image faded from social media. And one day, I saw her car parked outside a small wellness center 2 towns over Eder, near a yoga studio that catered to burnout recovery. I didn't approach. I didn't need anything from her. She was living out the version of healing she had spent years marketing. That irony belonged to her, not me. Aubrey's child was born in late February. I didn't find out through family. I heard from Claire, who had seen a quiet post online. No tags. No fanfare. Just a photo of small fingers wrapped around a larger thumb. For a long time I stared at the image. Not with jealousy or grief, but with something gentler. That child had no part in the theft. They were not a symbol of betrayal or competition. They were just new. I wrote a note on a cream envelope and mailed a small book I had once loved as a child. No name. No return address. Just a gesture. Because some cycles deserve to end with kindness, not inheritance. As spring approached, the Historical Society's winter tour came and went. Visitors passed through the house with quiet awe. One elderly man touched the handrail and whispered that it reminded him of his grandmother's home. A young girl asked if the cracks in the old plaster would ever be painted over. I told her no. That sometimes what remains visible tells you who stood here before you. She nodded. Not like a child, but like someone who already understood. In early March, I stood at the edge of the garden, watching the daffodils force their way through frost-bitten soil. It struck me then that healing doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout I'm done. It creeps in, one root at a time, pushing upward through whatever was buried. The land didn't need to forgive what happened. It simply continued. And so did I. I had never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted my house back, my name back, my version of the truth to matter. In the end, I didn't have to raise my voice or destroy anyone to get there. I just had to outlast the noise, restore what mattered, and let silence do what it does. Best make space for what's real. By late March, the light changed. Mornings stretched wider across the kitchen counters, catching the old copper kettle in a way that made it glow like something sacred. I had stopped thinking in terms of survival. My decisions no longer came from defense, but from design. The difference was subtle but absolute. I wasn't just rebuilding from what they tried to take. I was choosing what deserved to remain. I'd begun drawing again. Not professionally. Not for clients or competition panels. But privately. Floor plans. Yes. But also studies of spaces that held memory. A staircase corner where I once overheard Frances crying into the phone. The window ledge I used to sit on during storms as a child. These weren't blueprints. They were acknowledgments. They helped me see how this house had always spoken. It had simply waited for someone who would listen. One evening, Claire and I sat by the fire, reviewing archival blueprints she had found from a nearby property with similar architectural lineage. She pointed to a small deviation in the foundation, noting how the original builders had adjusted it to account for shifting soil. They weren't wrong, she said. They just didn't pretend it was perfect. That line stayed with me. Too often, the people who hurt us most do so, while pretending they're fixing something. Replacing tradition with convenience. Replacing honesty with performance. All while insisting it's for your own good. My father used to say that change was necessary for progress. But what he meant was that control required camouflage. The local paper asked to do a profile piece. At first, I said no. Then, after a week, I reconsidered. I agreed on one condition: they couldn't mention names. No focus on betrayal. No retelling of the legal dispute. I told them they could talk about restoration, about legacy, about what it means to inherit not just property, but responsibility. The article ran quietly on a Sunday morning. A few paragraphs. A photo of the house in early light. And a headline that read, "She fought to protect a home the world forgot." I didn't expect much. But 3 days later, I received a letter from a woman in Vermont who had lost her mother's farmhouse in a similar way. She wrote, "You reminded me I wasn't crazy for wanting to keep what they called obsolete." That was all she needed to say. In April, the cherry tree in the front yard bloomed earlier than usual. I took it as a small nod from nature that not all timing is a crisis. Some arrivals come before you expect them, and not every surprise is a threat. I hosted a small spring gathering in the backyard. Just 12 people. All of them friends, who had stood quietly beside me when others didn't. We served lemon tarts and white wine. Nothing too grand, but everything intentional. Toward the end, as the light softened and the guests began to linger near the steps, I read a passage from one of Frances's letters aloud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a small paragraph where she wrote about how she hoped whoever lives here next listens to the silence between the walls. That line made a few people pause. Claire said afterward that it felt like the house had finally spoken through me. I wasn't sure she was wrong. A few weeks later, Aubrey sent a single photograph in the mail. No notch. Just a photo of her baby. Lying on a handmade quilt I recognized as one Frances had sewn decades ago. It wasn't a peace offering. It didn't need to be. It was a thread, quiet and deliberate. I framed it in a small wooden frame and placed it near the hallway corner. Not in the main room. Not in full view. But there. I didn't forgive what she had done. Not because I couldn't, but because forgiveness, for me, wasn't a transaction. It was space. And she had finally honored the distance. That same month, I taught a short class at a local library, titled Memory Through Architecture. We didn't talk about lawsuits. We didn't mention family dynamics. We spoke of texture, of space, of how every home has a truth embedded in its materials. A woman in the back, probably in her 60s, raised her hand and asked, "But what do you do when the house feels like a wound?" I told her that wounds don't heal by pretending they weren't inflicted. They heal when someone stays. When someone chooses to care, even when it would be easier to leave. As I walked back that evening through the side gate, the porch light flicked on automatically. I paused for a second, hand on the frame. It occurred to me that I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. Not for their apology. Not for their return. Not even for their absence to make more sense. I had stopped measuring time by the people who left and started measuring it by what remained standing. And the house. It didn't just remain. It endured. Not because it was unbreakable, but because someone decided it was worth mending, worth remembering, worth reclaiming fully flaws. And all. That summer, I planted rosemary along the western wall, just beneath the kitchen window. Frances used to say rosemary was for remembrance. But I think she also liked how stubborn it was. How it could grow in poor soil, and still come back each year bolder than the last. As I knelt in the dirt, pressing roots into sun-warmed earth, I realized I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was living. The grief, the betrayal, and the sting of being called dramatic or difficult for standing my ground had faded. Not because they didn't matter, but because they no longer defined the shape of my days. They were part of the foundation now, buried, but essential. Like stone beneath the floorboards. You don't walk on them to forget, you walk on them because they hold you up. By August, the house had settled into its own kind of breath. It creaked less, as if it trusted me now. The light followed familiar paths across the rooms. On quiet mornings, I could almost hear Frances humming. Not literally. Not in a way that needed explaining. But in the way memory sometimes curls around the corner of your mind without asking permission. I wasn't haunted. I was held. Not everything that lingers is meant to be exorcised. Some things stay because they've earned the right to remain. One afternoon, I spoke at a small gathering of women in design. The topic was supposed to be restoration methods in historic homes. But what we ended up talking about was erasure. How easily some names disappear from credit lists. How many women are expected to stay silent for the sake of family or politeness or legacy. I shared my story carefully, without naming names. Focusing not on the drama, but on the process. Not what they did, but what I chose after the locks changed. After the lawsuit, after the silence, a younger woman came up to me afterward, eyes wide but steady, and said, "I didn't know we were allowed to say no like that." I smiled. "We always were," I told her. "We just weren't encouraged to believe it." In September, I replaced the house number plate. It was a small detail, barely noticeable to anyone else. But it mattered to me. The old brass plate had been installed during my father's ownership, and I had kept it out of habit. Not meaning. The new one was simpler. Engraved on slate, mounted directly into the brick. It didn't announce anything grand. But it marked something final. A turning of the page that didn't need ceremony. Just presence. When I stepped back to look at it, I felt something shift, not in the house, but in me. I no longer needed anyone else to witness this closure, for it to feel real. Claire and I still met weekly. Sometimes, to plan community projects. Sometimes just to walk and talk about nothing. She once joked that the house had become a character of its own. And I laughed because it was true. Houses remember. They absorb energy. They reflect back who we are when no one's looking. This one had seen versions of me I no longer needed, and it had seen me come home to myself. I never got a true apology from my father or Aubrey, and I stopped waiting for one. Not because I forgave everything, but because I finally understood that closure isn't something people give you. It's something you claim when you decide you're done bleeding for someone else's comfort. I used to think justice meant seeing them lose something. Now I know justice is keeping what's yours without asking permission. The last project I finished before autumn was restoring the attic into a small creative studio. Sunlight streamed through the east window in the morning. Soft and golden. I placed a single chair there, beside a stack of empty sketch pads. Not because I had big plans to launch something new, but because I wanted a place where I could create without performance. A space where nothing needed to be proven or defended. Just made. Just mine. As I sat there one evening, watching the light fade through the glass, I thought about legacy. Not the kind you inherit, but the kind you build with your choices. The kind that doesn't always come with applause, but comes with peace. The kind that whispers instead of shouts. I had become someone different, not in spite of the betrayal, but because of how I answered it. Not with vengeance. Not with bitterness. But with presence. With staying. With naming what was mine, and keeping it with both hands. So here's the question I leave you with. When the people who claim to love you turn against you, not with cruelty, but with entitlement, who do you become when no one's watching? What do you protect when the applause fades, and all that's left is the echo of your own voice in a house that finally belongs to you?